Hey there, fellow literature explorers. Welcome back to Frame Shift. Today, we're stepping into The Gray Man, the 2022 action thriller that on its surface feels like a glossy Netflix blockbuster, but when examined more carefully, opens itself up to all sorts of fascinating discussions about identity, morality, and the blurred boundaries between order and chaos. Before we dive in, let me make something clear. This isn't a conventional movie review. What we're embarking on together is a deeply intellectual and theoretical exploration, a critical analysis intended less for casual viewers and more for those of us who love peeling back the cinematic layers, as if studying a novel, examining symbolism, thematic structure, and subtext. If that's the kind of journey you enjoy, I'd love for you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me as we continue to explore films as though they are texts to be interpreted rather than products to be consumed. There's something about the surface appeal of this film that reminds me of sitting in a cafe, overhearing someone tell a dramatic story, only to realize later that their pauses, their choice of words, even the details they left out, reveal more than the plot itself. That's how this movie feels to me. It invites you in with a promise of fast-paced espionage, but what it really wants to do is explore the spaces where loyalty and violence collide, where survival instincts and morality are in constant tension. And perhaps the reason it resonates with me personally is because I've often felt drawn to stories about people who live between worlds, people who don't quite belong in the categories society sets up for them. Growing up, I often felt I had to navigate multiple identities at once, always shifting how I presented myself depending on who was in front of me. This film's protagonist, caught between his past as a convict and his present as an operative who works in the grayest zones of morality, feels strangely familiar to me, like a cinematic echo of those internal negotiations I once made silently every day. On its surface, the film is dazzling, filled with the kinds of set pieces we expect in modern espionage thrillers. Explosions light up city streets, bullets whiz past in impossible choreography, and larger-than-life characters hunt each other down across continents. But if you pause long enough to look beyond the spectacle, you find something almost novelistic in its layering. The choices of the protagonist are framed not just as survival tactics, but as existential dilemmas. He is at once a weapon and a man, an assassin and a reluctant hero, a pawn and a thinker. His movements are painted in shadow, his loyalties are hazy, his motives carefully obscured until just the right moment. And I find that fascinating because it forces us, as viewers, to do the work of interpretation. We're not told exactly who he is, we're given fragments, hints, impressions. That ambiguity invites us to imagine, to fill in the silences, to test the borders of what we're willing to believe. The narrative unfolds like a chase, but also like a parable. It begins in prison, of all places, where a man with nothing left to lose is offered a second chance, though not really a chance at freedom, but an exchange of one form of captivity for another. He's recruited to become a gray man, a covert assassin who works outside official channels, his identity erased in service of clandestine missions. Already, the metaphor is rich. Freedom at the cost of invisibility, redemption at the cost of erasure. What does it mean to trade one's humanity for utility, to accept a role in which success means no one will ever know who you are? That opening premise sets the stage for everything to follow, and for me, it's where the deeper intrigue lies. The action spirals outward from there. A mission gone wrong leads to the discovery of dangerous secrets, and suddenly the hunter becomes the hunted. Our protagonist finds himself pursued not only by faceless enemies, but by forces within his own organization, exposing the truth that betrayal often wears the mask of authority. In the sweep of the plot, we travel from neon-lit streets to grand palaces, from intimate conversations to chaos erupting in public squares. Yet, despite the scale, the story is never really about global conspiracies. It is about the tension between survival and conscience, about whether a man defined by his usefulness can ever reclaim his humanity. What excites me most, though, are the moments where the narrative slows down, when the protagonist is given space to reflect, or rather, when the film allows us to see the reflection even if he doesn't voice it. There are quiet, almost literary touches, a cigarette glowing in darkness like a solitary beacon, a child's drawing tucked into a notebook, the lingering shot of a face weathered by regret. These are the details that remind us this is not just spectacle, it is allegory. They ask us to see violence not as thrill, but as commentary, to recognize the irony of a man hunted for exposing truth in a world that claims to uphold it. And of course, no analysis would be complete without teasing the elements that elevate the story from linear chase to labyrinthine moral puzzle. The character of the antagonist is one such element, a man unhinged, flamboyant, ruthless, but also oddly magnetic. He is the perfect foil, embodying chaos with such clarity that we cannot look away. His every line feels like a provocation, daring us to question what separates him from the man he hunts. Both are killers, after all. Both have blood on their hands. The difference lies not in what they do, but in how they justify it. And that's where the story unsettles us most, by refusing to give us the comfort of a clear moral high ground. Another twist lies in the fragile thread of family. For all its explosions and espionage, the story finds its emotional anchor in the bond between the protagonist and a young girl he is determined to protect. She is innocence in a world of corruption, the reminder that even in the grayest terrain there can be light. Their relationship is not paternal in the conventional sense. It is wary, tentative, but genuine. And through it, we glimpse a possibility that perhaps redemption is not in escaping the system, but in protecting something untainted by it. I think what moves me most is how the story refuses to give easy answers. Every time we think we know where it's going, it twists. The betrayal runs deeper than expected, the loyalties are more fragile, the stakes more personal than political. Even in its resolution, there is no clean victory. There are scars, compromises, questions left unresolved. And that feels honest to me, because life, after all, rarely offers neat endings. We are all in some way caught in our own gray zones, navigating choices that blur the lines between right and wrong, self-interest and duty, survival and sacrifice. So as we set the stage for the deeper analysis ahead, I invite you to think of this film not as just another action thriller, but as a text alive with metaphors and contradictions. Watch the explosions, yes, but also watch the silences. Pay attention to the way loyalty fractures, to the way power masks corruption, to the way identity dissolves under the weight of utility. Ask yourself what it means to live as a gray man in your own life, what compromises you've made, what identities you've shifted, what truths you've concealed to survive. That's why this film resonates with me. Because beneath its glossy surface lies a story about all of us, about the gray we carry within, about the endless negotiation between who we are and who the world demands we be. And that is what we'll be unraveling together in this analysis, layer by layer, symbol by symbol, thought by thought. So stay with me, my friends. The chase is only beginning. The story begins not with spectacle, but with silence, the kind of silence that speaks of lives already marked by compromise. A man sits in a prison cell, the echo of steel bars around him, his life reduced to repetition, routine, and the inevitability of wasted time. Yet even here something is different about him. He isn't broken, not entirely. He waits, he watches, and when the opportunity comes, he listens carefully. A government man slides into the cell, offering him something that feels less like a choice and more like an ultimatum. Become a tool for them or fade away into obscurity. He takes the offer, stepping into a life where his identity is stripped, replaced with a number, and his usefulness is the only thing that defines him. This is how he becomes an operative, one of the gray men, the invisible hands who carry out missions no one will ever admit to sanctioning. Already, the story frames him as both saved and damned, a man freed from the prison only to step into a larger, more abstract kind of captivity. Years pass, though the film spares us from dwelling on them directly. Instead, we meet him in motion, in a world where his existence depends on efficiency and silence. His life is lived in shadows, slipping from one mission to the next, never leaving a trace beyond the bodies and secrets left behind. The opening mission we see is emblematic of this duality, a task to eliminate a target whose crimes are hidden under layers of respectability. But unlike the other assassins who work with cold detachment, he carries within him a flicker of conscience. When a child enters the line of fire, he hesitates, adjusts, and in that hesitation we glimpse the very thing that sets him apart. He is an assassin, yes, but not a machine. His humanity is intact, fragile, but still burning. The mission escalates quickly. Gunfire erupts in the confined space of a crowded New Year's celebration, a haze of smoke and fireworks blurring the boundaries between chaos and celebration. As bullets tear through the night, he moves with precision, but also with a kind of moral calculation that seems alien in this world of orders and outcomes. His target falls, but in dying leaves behind more than blood. A secret, encoded and hidden, finds its way into his possession, and with it, everything begins to shift. He is no longer just a man on a mission. He is a man in possession of knowledge that could topple the very organization that created him. This is the point at which the chase truly begins. The object he holds, seemingly small, nothing more than a drive, becomes a symbol of betrayal, corruption, and the fragility of trust. The organization that once protected him turns inward, its gaze now fixed on silencing him before the truth can surface. We meet the antagonist not in shadows, but in flamboyant bursts of cruelty. A man unrestrained by rules, charming in the way a flame is to a moth, and every bit as destructive. He is hired to hunt down our protagonist, not with the precision of a soldier, but with the sadistic glee of someone who enjoys the chase more than the victory. From the moment he enters the story, the stakes rise. We understand immediately that this is no ordinary villain. He is unpredictability made flesh. The plot weaves between cat-and-mouse encounters, each one escalating in scale. A tense exchange in a safe house reveals the precariousness of loyalty. Even those who claim to be allies are quick to weigh their own survival over solidarity. Gunfire follows, windows shatter, and the city itself becomes a labyrinth of danger. The protagonist moves through it all with a careful balance of instinct and restraint, a man constantly choosing between survival and conscience. And in this balance, we see the central tension of the story play out, not just the fight between him and his pursuers, but the fight within himself. It's in these early passages that the emotional anchor of the film reveals itself. Amidst the chaos, he is tasked not only with surviving, but with protecting someone else. A young girl whose innocence starkly contrasts the brutal world around her. She's not just a ward, she is a symbol of everything that remains uncorrupted in him. Their relationship is tender, even if understated. She sees in him not a weapon, but a guardian, and he sees in her the possibility of redemption. Every decision he makes, every risk he takes, feels refracted through this bond. It complicates him, softens him, and elevates the story beyond spectacle. The settings shift constantly, as though the film wants to remind us that in this kind of life, home is nowhere. From crowded urban streets lit by neon and fireworks to shadowed safe houses where trust unravels, to grand estates where the powerful sip wine while plotting betrayal, each location deepens the sense of dislocation. There is no safe ground, no stable center. The geography mirrors the protagonist's existence, transient, hunted, suspended in a constant state of impermanence. The antagonist, meanwhile, grows bolder, his pursuit both terrifying and grotesquely entertaining. He mocks, he taunts, he leaves trails of destruction with a smile that suggests none of it matters, not the lives lost, not the cities scarred. He represents the absolute opposite of the protagonist, not only in methods but in philosophy. Where the hero hesitates, the villain indulges. Where the hero questions, the villain thrives on the absence of morality. Their inevitable confrontation simmers beneath each chase sequence, a collision that we know will not just be physical but ideological. The further the story progresses, the more the idea of trust becomes destabilized. Allies crumble into betrayers, mentors reveal darker motives, and every line of loyalty is blurred by ambition and fear. The protagonist is not just hunted by external forces, but undermined by those who once claimed to guide him. There's something Shakespearean about it, the sense of betrayal from within being more corrosive than attacks from without. And as viewers, we're asked to reckon with the same question he must. If the people who gave you purpose turn against you, what remains of your identity? By the time this section of the narrative builds toward its midpoint, the weight of the story is no longer just in its action. It is in the moral exhaustion of a man forced to carry both his past and his conscience while the world insists he let go of both. The chases grow more elaborate, streets torn apart by shootouts, trains becoming battlegrounds, entire squares turned into arenas of survival. But behind it all, what resonates is the fragility of human connection. The young girl's safety becomes both his burden and his salvation, grounding him even as the world spirals further into betrayal and chaos. The tension is relentless, and yet the story finds room for quiet beats that remind us of its heart. A conversation stolen between moments of crisis, a memory surfacing at the wrong time, a glance that conveys more than dialogue ever could. These are the flourishes that transform what could be just another action story into something textured, layered, and deeply human. The gray man at the center of it all is no longer invisible to us. He is revealed through his choices, his hesitations, his quiet acts of defiance against a world that insists he must abandon his humanity to survive. And so, as the first half draws us deeper into the labyrinth, we are left with a protagonist increasingly surrounded, increasingly burdened, and yet somehow increasingly resolute. The stakes are not only about who survives the next confrontation, but about whether survival itself will come at the cost of becoming the very thing he has resisted all along. The story presses forward with the weight of inevitability, as though the walls are closing in on the man at the center of it all. He has carried the burden of truth into the shadows, a truth etched into the small device that everyone around him seems willing to kill for, and now the consequences of possession grow heavier by the hour. Each city he crosses into becomes a battleground, each supposed sanctuary collapsing into ambush and betrayal. The world no longer feels expansive. Instead, it feels suffocating, a globe-sized cage where nowhere is safe. And yet he pushes forward, not only because he must survive, but because something inside him refuses to give up the fragile bond he has found, the sliver of humanity he clings to in the form of the young girl who depends on him. It's here that the hunt tightens into something more personal. The flamboyant predator chasing him, a man both sadistic and strangely charismatic, escalates his pursuit. The early moments of taunts and showmanship begin to curdle into obsession. He is no longer satisfied with killing his target. He wants to break him, to reduce him to nothing, to prove that no humanity can endure the relentless grinding machinery of violence. Their encounters grow closer, their confrontations more brutal, until the story no longer feels like espionage at all, but like two philosophies clashing under the guise of combat. One believes in chaos as a kind of liberation, the other clings to morality as though it were the last rope keeping him tethered to himself. One of the most riveting set pieces unfolds on a train, a kind of crucible where all the forces converging on the protagonist ignite at once. He sits quietly, watchful, the child hidden close, while shadows gather at every door. Then the attack begins, windows shatter, steel screams against steel, the rhythm of the train becomes the rhythm of combat. Every bullet ricochets with narrative weight, survival balanced against conscience, self-preservation clashing with the instinct to protect. He fights with precision, with desperation, and with a kind of grim artistry that makes every movement feel both calculated and improvised. By the time the train grinds to a halt, torn open and aflame, it's clear that this is not just another pursuit. This is war, one waged in the name of survival, but also in defiance of those who would turn a man into nothing but a weapon. After this, the betrayals grow sharper. An old ally, someone who once seemed unshakable, reveals loyalties bent towards self-preservation. Words of camaraderie dissolve into the cold metal of a drawn gun. For the protagonist, it's a devastating blow, not because he didn't expect betrayal, but because part of him hoped loyalty still had meaning in this fractured world. He survives, of course, but each survival costs him something. A fragment of trust, a piece of belief, a further step into isolation. The child becomes more than a dependent during these trials. Her presence serves as a reminder of what is at stake beyond the gray, beyond the endless cycle of missions and betrayal. In her gaze, he sees the possibility of redemption. Her laughter, rare but piercing when it comes, cuts through the tension like light breaking through storm clouds. Protecting her gives his choices meaning, grounding him when every instinct tells him to abandon all else for survival. Their bond is what keeps him human, and the story seems to know this, returning again and again to moments where she anchors him, where she reminds him that he is not entirely lost. The antagonist, meanwhile, sharpens his cruelty. He stages elaborate traps, kills without hesitation, and turns each pursuit into a performance. His violence is not pragmatic, it is theatrical, designed to unsettle, to mock. He taunts the protagonist not only with threats but with truths spoken aloud, the blood on his hands, the contradictions of his choices, the hypocrisy of those who employ him. Each encounter between them becomes a dialogue of fists and philosophy, their words as sharp as their weapons. The villain insists that morality is an illusion, that the world is built on power and nothing else. The hero resists, though every betrayal and every wound seems to lend weight to the other's argument. The climax builds through these encounters, each one escalating, until the final confrontation feels not just inevitable but necessary. They meet in a space stripped of distractions, where nothing exists but the two of them and the battle that must end one way or another. The fight is brutal, intimate, and unrelenting. Every punch, every strike feels like a question. Who are you when everything else is stripped away? Do you still have a self, or are you only the violence you commit? The child's life hangs in the balance, the truth on the drive remains contested, and the line between survival and morality grows razor-thin. In the end, it isn't brute strength that secures survival, it is resolve, the refusal to surrender the last threads of conscience. The villain falls, but the victory is not triumphant. It is scarred, bloodied, hollowed out by the losses endured along the way. The protagonist stands, but he does not stand as a hero. He stands as a man who has survived the crucible and carries the weight of it in his silence. The resolution unfolds in quieter tones. The organization that sought to control him still lurks in the shadows, still powerful, still willing to erase him if it serves their ends. He knows this, accepts it, and yet walks away with the girl at his side. Their bond, fragile but unbroken, becomes the true conclusion of the story. It is not the downfall of a villain or the exposure of corruption that matters most. It is the choice to preserve humanity in a world intent on erasing it. The film closes not with neat answers, but with lingering questions. Can a man defined by violence ever find peace? Can a child raised in shadows ever step fully into the light? And perhaps most hauntingly, Can morality survive in a world built on betrayal and power? These questions hang in the silence after the final scene, unresolved but resonant, as though inviting us to carry them with us into our own lives. What makes this resolution so compelling is precisely its lack of closure. The world remains dangerous, the forces of corruption remain intact, and the protagonist remains hunted. Yet in the act of choosing humanity, in refusing to surrender to the chaos, he achieves a kind of victory, not the loud, definitive kind, but the quiet kind that literature so often celebrates. It's the victory of endurance, of moral clarity maintained in spite of everything, of choosing to protect rather than destroy. The story leaves us not with certainty, but with reflection. And that reflection is what lingers most, because in the end, the chase, the violence, the betrayals, all of it serves as a mirror for us. We are asked to consider our own gray zones, our own compromises, our own battles between survival and conscience. The man at the center of this story may walk away scarred, but he walks away having held on to the one thing that mattered most, the refusal to let the world strip him of his humanity. Character analysis, when approached not as a catalog of traits, but as an unfolding narrative of human complexity, reveals to us how deeply the film understands people who operate at the edge of morality and survival. It is here that we step away from the clatter of gunfire and the rhythm of pursuit to pause, to look into the eyes of these figures, and to understand what their presence whispers about the human condition. The film might be packed with action, yet beneath every explosion lies the question of who these individuals are and what keeps them from dissolving into shadows. At the heart of the story stands the man who begins as a number, an operative, an invisible figure who lives in the spaces between orders and silence. What makes him magnetic is not his physical prowess, though it is considerable, but the quiet dignity with which he moves through a world designed to strip people of their conscience. He begins in prison, a place where time flattens men into husks, yet he is given the chance to exchange one kind of captivity for another, freedom in name, servitude in reality. He could have embraced detachment, becoming a weapon honed for others' use, but he never relinquishes that sliver of humanity that sets him apart. What defines him most is restraint. He kills, but he does not revel in it. He survives, but he does not sacrifice his conscience at every turn. In this restraint lies his difference, a willingness to see life as more than utility. His identity is paradoxical. He is nameless, known by a number, yet in this anonymity we glimpse his deepest humanity. Without the distractions of identity markers, titles, family names, social status, what remains is simply the essence of a man asked to navigate impossible choices. The story becomes a meditation on whether a person can remain human when stripped of everything but function. Through him, we see the constant tension between survival and morality. His care for the girl entrusted to him is not an incidental subplot, it is the beating heart of his resistance. Every time he risks himself to shield her, he asserts that even in the grayest world, light can exist if we choose to carry it. He resonates because we recognize in him the battle we all face in smaller, quieter forms, the refusal to let the machinery of life erode the better parts of ourselves. Then there is the antagonist, the flamboyant predator whose every appearance feels like a stage performance of cruelty. If the protagonist embodies restraint, this figure is indulgence incarnate. He relishes violence not as necessity but as entertainment, transforming murder into theater. His brightly colored shirts, his smirking dialogue, his exaggerated gestures, all of it is designed to unsettle, to remind us that unpredictability is as dangerous as brute strength. He thrives in chaos, turning it into a playground where others see only danger. What makes him particularly compelling is that he is not wrong when he mocks the protagonist's moral compass. He points out the contradictions with ease. A man who kills for an institution that pretends it has no blood on its hands, who claims to protect innocence while leaving destruction in his wake. His taunts sting because they expose hypocrisies we cannot ignore. Yet his flaw lies in his nihilism. In believing that morality is illusion, he dismisses the very thing that gives life meaning. His cruelty, unchecked by conscience, becomes his undoing. Where the protagonist finds strength in restraint, the antagonist weakens himself by overindulgence, turning excess into recklessness. Their final confrontation is not only physical, it is a contest of philosophies, a battle between chaos and conscience. The girl, though often silent and small compared to the forces raging around her, carries immense symbolic weight. She is innocence, yes, but not in a naive or reductive way. She is a reminder that purity is fragile, that it can exist even in worlds designed to crush it. Her relationship with the protagonist is the story's emotional anchor. In her presence, he is reminded of the possibility of redemption. He sees in her the life he might have lived had circumstances been different, and protecting her becomes his way of protecting that possibility for himself as well. She is not merely a ward to be saved. She is a mirror of his own humanity. Every moment they share, a glance, a word of trust, the simple act of holding hands, reminds us that this narrative of violence and betrayal is, at its core, about the endurance of connection. Around these central figures swirl the secondary characters who embody the machinery of betrayal and corruption. Mentors who should guide instead manipulate, allies who should protect instead falter, colleagues who should stand beside him instead crumble when faced with the threat of their own destruction. They represent the fragility of loyalty in a world built on survival. Their betrayals wound not only because of their immediate danger, but because they force the protagonist to reckon with the illusion of solidarity. Through them, the film reminds us of how easily ideals can collapse when tested, how quickly trust can erode when self-preservation becomes paramount. The organization itself, though not embodied in a single figure, becomes a kind of character in its own right. Cold, calculating, invisible, it hovers over every scene as the unseen hand pulling strings. It promises protection but thrives on expendability. For them, operatives are numbers, tools to be discarded when inconvenient. In this way, the institution serves as the true antagonist, the force that erodes identity and enforces compliance. The flamboyant villain may hunt with flair, but it is the faceless system that sustains the cycle. This duality of villainy, one embodied in a man, the other in a structure, offers the audience a layered view of power. Evil is not only flamboyant and chaotic, it is also bureaucratic, sanitized, hidden behind official seals and polished offices. Yet despite the bleakness of these portrayals, the film never loses sight of the possibility of choice. Each character embodies a path. The protagonist demonstrates that humanity can endure even in shadows. The antagonist reveals the dangers of indulging in cruelty. The girl embodies hope, the organization corruption, and the secondary figures the fragility of loyalty. Together, they create a mosaic of human responses to power and survival. Each choice, whether noble or cowardly, ripples outward, shaping the fate of others. This analysis makes clear why the characters linger with us after the credits roll. They are not abstractions of good and evil, but layered portraits of people caught in impossible circumstances. We may never live in their world of espionage and violence, yet their struggles mirror our own. Who among us has not faced the temptation to compromise for survival? Who has not felt the sting of betrayal from someone once trusted? Who has not wrestled with the tension between doing what is right and doing what is easy? The narrative thrives on these human resonances. By investing its characters with depth rather than archetype, it ensures that every explosion and gunfight carries emotional weight. When the protagonist hesitates before pulling a trigger, we feel his conscience. When the antagonist mocks morality, we hear echoes of our own doubts. When the girl smiles in the midst of chaos, we are reminded of why survival matters at all. These figures are not just vehicles for action, they are reflections of ourselves, distorted and magnified by the extremity of their circumstances. Ultimately, character analysis reveals that the true battle is not fought with guns or fists but within the human soul. Each figure embodies a response to the grayness of the world, whether to surrender, to indulge, to resist, or to hope. And it is in watching them, in reflecting on their choices, that we are invited to examine our own. What fascinates me most when reflecting on the making of this film is how much of its intensity exists not only on screen, but in the stories that orbit the production itself. Beneath the spectacle of elaborate chases, firefights, and globe-spanning espionage, there lies a rich tapestry of strange facts, surprising anecdotes, and little-known moments that shape the final work. To me, these details are as gripping as the story itself, because they remind us that cinema is not simply born fully formed, but rather constructed, piece by piece, through the decisions, accidents, and even outright chaos that happen behind the scenes. One of the most curious aspects of its creation lies in the way the directors, known for crafting large-scale spectacles filled with superheroes and city-shattering battles, pivoted here into a darker, leaner type of story. Many people were surprised that they chose this project as their next venture after reshaping an entire cinematic universe. But if you look closely, the decision makes a strange kind of sense. They were no longer content with the broad strokes of mythology. Instead, they wanted to dive into the murky spaces of moral grayness, where no single character could be labeled entirely good or entirely evil. What makes this unusual is that it was an enormous risk. To go from commanding the cultural weight of billion-dollar franchises to experimenting with a story that, while action-heavy, is far more character-driven, was seen by many insiders as a gamble. Yet the directors themselves insisted that risk was precisely the point. There's also the strange fact of how much of the production was defined by travel. Rather than confining themselves to controlled studio environments, the crew moved across multiple countries, chasing authenticity in each location. They shot in Prague, Vienna, and parts of France, and at times the filming schedule seemed almost like a spy mission itself. Cast and crew would arrive in a new country, set up for an elaborate sequence, then vanish as quickly as they had come, leaving behind stories of tanks rolling through narrow European streets or massive action scenes staged in cities that hadn't seen such chaos since wartime. This constant movement gave the film an unusual sense of authenticity, but it also meant that the production team was juggling logistical nightmares daily. There were stories of night shoots running until dawn in historic city squares, where actors clad in tactical gear stood side by side with costumed extras playing civilians caught in the crossfire, all while local residents peeked out from windows in awe. Perhaps the strangest anecdote revolves around the lead actor's physical transformation. Known for his polished, controlled presence in other projects, he threw himself into training in a way that startled even seasoned stunt coordinators. He spent months in combat training, learning how to move not just like a fighter but like a ghost, quiet, efficient, precise. The curious part is how much of his preparation never made it to screen. He practiced for weeks on underwater escapes, breath-holding techniques, and submerged combat drills, yet only fragments of that training remain visible in the finished film. It's a reminder of how much effort exists beneath the surface of a polished movie, whole worlds of labor cut away for pacing or narrative clarity, yet still shaping the authenticity of what we do see. Equally intriguing is the tale of how the antagonist's appearance evolved. Initially, his wardrobe was written to be much more restrained, dark suits, tactical gear, muted colors. But the actor pushed back, arguing that this man was not only a villain but a performer, someone who turned violence into theater. His flamboyant shirts, his almost absurd mustache, and his campy mannerisms were born from improvisation and playfulness. At first, the directors were uncertain, worried the performance would undercut the seriousness of the narrative. But gradually, they realized that this heightened presence created exactly the effect they needed. A villain who was both terrifying and unforgettable. To this day, many critics agree that his portrayal, strange as it was, brought an unpredictability that elevated the entire film. Another oddity worth noting is the way the production integrated drones. We're accustomed now to seeing aerial shots in action films, but here drones weren't only used for sweeping establishing shots. They were flown through tight city streets, ducking under bridges, and even weaving between actors during chase scenes. The cinematographer revealed later that many of the film's most breathtaking sequences were the result of experimentation. At times, drones crashed, smashed into walls, or spun out of control mid-shot. Instead of discarding those moments, the editors sometimes folded the chaos into the sequence, embracing the imperfection as part of the aesthetic. That willingness to lean into the accidental is rare in such a polished Hollywood production, and it shows a strange confidence in imperfection. There were also whispers about the toll the production took on its cast. The stunt work was so demanding that nearly every principal actor left the set with injuries, sprained wrists, bruised ribs, even a few dislocated shoulders. One actor reportedly continued filming, with stitches still fresh in his face, after an accident during a stunt rehearsal. What makes this strange isn't just the commitment to realism, but the culture that formed among the cast because of it. They began competing over who could endure the most, who could shrug off injuries without complaint. It became, oddly enough, a form of camaraderie, a way of bonding over shared pain, as though the shoot itself mirrored the brutality of the story they were telling. Among the trivia most fans don't know is the curious way dialogue was shaped on set. The script, though meticulously written, often left room for improvisation. Some of the most memorable quips from the villain were ad-libbed, delivered with such conviction that they remained untouched in the final cut. Likewise, the quieter exchanges between the protagonist and the girl he protects were sometimes improvised to capture genuine emotion rather than scripted precision. There's even a story that in one particularly tense scene, the girl forgot her lines entirely, yet the lead actor stayed in character, guiding her gently until she recovered. The directors were so moved by the authenticity of that moment that they kept the take, believing it revealed more about their bond than any scripted dialogue ever could. Stranger still are the cultural ripples caused by the production in the cities where it filmed. In one European town, locals were so entranced by the arrival of tanks and helicopters for a massive action sequence that they gathered in droves just to watch the chaos unfold. For weeks afterward, the townspeople told stories of the invasion that turned their quiet streets into a war zone. Some even claim to have nightmares about soldiers charging down alleys, blurring the line between cinematic fiction and lived memory. These odd echoes remind us that films are not only artifacts on screens, they are lived experiences for the communities where they are created. The editing process also contained its share of peculiarities. Film was initially much longer, with whole subplots involving secondary characters that never made it to the final cut. In fact, insiders say the first assembly ran nearly 3 hours, weaving in more backstory for the organization that trained the protagonist and further expanding the antagonist's eccentricities. The strangeness here is how ruthlessly the directors pared it down, choosing pace over world building. What we see is the sleek, relentless chase version of the story. What remains unseen is the fuller mythology that might have transformed it into a different kind of narrative altogether. The film that reached audiences, then, is as much defined by what is absent as by what is present. And perhaps the most curious fact of all is how the film's existence seems to rest at the intersection of contradictions. It is a global blockbuster with the heart of an intimate thriller. It is a story of espionage told with the flamboyance of a comic book. It is a carefully scripted narrative that thrives on improvisation and accident. Even the way it was released, straight to streaming, yet with the budget of a major theatrical tentpole, adds to its strangeness. It is both massive and ephemeral, designed to be consumed instantly yet layered with enough craft and eccentricity to reward repeat analysis. Reflecting on all this, I can't help but see the film itself as a metaphor for cinema's unpredictable alchemy. Strange facts and accidents, an actor's improvisation, a drone's crash, a line forgotten, become the very fabric of what makes the final work compelling. The production's unusual choices, its risks, its willingness to embrace flamboyance and imperfection, all converge to create something that lingers longer than expected. It is proof that the strangest details often become the most resonant truths, and that behind every polished scene lies a story as chaotic and fascinating as the film itself. There is something about certain films that makes them linger in the imagination, not simply because of what happens, but because of the way what happens means something larger. The story we encounter here unfolds like a labyrinth of collisions, between morality and survival, between the visible spectacle of violence and the quieter, haunting shadows of its aftermath. To approach it critically is to move past the pulse of gunfire and the roar of engines, and to sit with what those sounds are trying to say. It is to recognize that each event is not only a piece of narrative machinery, but also a philosophical inquiry staged on the screen. The prison sequence at the very beginning is a prime example of this. On one level, it functions as a practical setup, a man plucked from confinement, handed an alternative to slow decay behind bars. Yet from a critical perspective, it speaks volumes about how societies create expendable tools from broken men. The promise of freedom is not freedom at all, but a barter. Trade your life for servitude, your autonomy for utility. This opening establishes the protagonist not as a chosen hero, but as a commodity, a number in a ledger, useful only so long as his skills serve the invisible masters pulling strings. What resonates here is the way the film mirrors carceral systems in reality, the illusion of choice, the promise of redemption dangled as a leash, the transformation of people into assets. By beginning this way, the narrative foregrounds its central question. How much of yourself must you give away before you cease to be yourself at all? Then comes the event that shatters the fragile illusion of stability. The moment the operative receives information that forces him to disobey his orders, to protect innocence rather than extinguish it. This decision is the pivot on which the entire story rests, because it transforms him from functionary into dissident. From a critical lens, this moment illustrates the danger of conscience in systems that thrive on obedience. The fact that he chooses compassion over protocol is what sets the chase in motion, what unleashes the wrath of his employers. Here, the narrative insists that morality carries consequences, that goodness is punished in worlds designed to reward compliance. It's not simply a beat in an action plot. It is a thematic declaration that decency, though admirable, is radical and dangerous when it defies power. The arrival of the antagonist reframes this tension in strikingly theatrical terms. His entrance is almost comedic, his demeanor exaggerated, his attire flamboyant. Yet beneath this spectacle lies something deeply unsettling. He embodies the indulgence of cruelty unrestrained. He is not simply a hunter. He is performance art stitched together from sadism. Critics have often pointed out how his character destabilizes the tone, walking a line between camp and menace. And yet this contradiction is precisely what makes him terrifying, because evil in its truest form is often absurd. His strange humor, his mocking of moral codes, his gleeful taunts are not just quirks. They are rhetorical weapons designed to dismantle the protagonist's faith in his own convictions. Thematically, he represents nihilism, the worldview that insists nothing matters, that morality is a costume no less artificial than his bright shirts. The battles between him and the operative, then, are not only physical, they are debates, existential arguments waged through violence. One of the most significant events is the plane sequence, where survival depends not only on skill but on sheer will. This event, often described by audiences as a masterstroke of tension, is more than spectacle. It is metaphor incarnate, a man clinging to life in the most precarious of circumstances, literally suspended between earth and sky, order and chaos. Critics have noted how the scene crystallizes the film's obsession with liminality, the spaces in between, where identity and survival are uncertain. The operative's fight aboard that collapsing vessel is, in symbolic terms, his fight against inevitability itself. That he emerges battered but alive underscores the film's insistence that survival, though costly, is still possible if one refuses to surrender entirely. Another event worth analyzing is the quiet moment between the operative and the girl he protects, when the chaos pauses long enough for them to breathe. In a narrative so saturated with destruction, this stillness feels almost shocking. From a literary perspective, these interludes are crucial. They remind us what is at stake, why all the violence matters. The girl represents not simply innocence but possibility, the future uncorrupted, the life that might still be lived free from shadows. Their shared silences, their fragile trust, their subtle gestures of care are the antidote to the antagonist's flamboyant nihilism. They reassert that humanity exists not in grand gestures, but in small moments of connection. Critics have praised these quiet exchanges as the film's emotional core, the necessary counterbalance to its relentless pace. Without them, the narrative would risk collapsing into spectacle. With them, it achieves resonance. As the story unfolds into its crescendo, the betrayals pile higher. Colleagues reveal themselves as traitors, mentors reveal themselves as manipulators, and institutions reveal themselves as hollow facades of justice. From a critical perspective, these betrayals are not merely twists for shock value, they are structural critiques of power itself. The narrative insists that in systems built on secrecy and violence, loyalty is an illusion. Everyone, when cornered, chooses self-preservation. This cynicism is difficult to digest, yet it mirrors the disillusionment of modern audiences who recognize the fractures in their own institutions. When the operative survives betrayal after betrayal, what lingers is not triumph but exhaustion. We understand that he is not fighting a single villain, he is fighting the erosion of trust itself. The climactic confrontation between protagonist and antagonist is staged less as a duel of equals than as an inevitability, the collision of two philosophies that could not coexist indefinitely. Critics have debated the degree to which this confrontation satisfies, with some arguing it resolves too neatly, others praising its brutal efficiency. But what matters most is the symbolic victory it secures. The antagonist's flamboyance collapses under its own weight, his indulgence undone by the very excess he thought made him invincible. The operative's restraint, mocked throughout the film, proves to be his ultimate strength. From a critical standpoint, this resolution insists that chaos, no matter how theatrical, is unsustainable. Discipline, conscience, and refusal to indulge entirely in destruction allow survival. Yet the resolution is not entirely triumphant. The operative emerges alive, yes, but scarred, weary, and marked by loss. The girl's survival is fragile, and the trust between them, though strong, is shadowed by everything endured. The institution remains, its faceless power undiminished, ready to replace the fallen antagonist with another. Critics have rightly noted that this conclusion refuses the comfort of closure. Instead, it insists on the persistence of struggle. The fight may be won, but the war is eternal. This lack of finality is what elevates the film from mere action entertainment into something resonant. It lingers because it acknowledges that survival does not equal victory, and that morality is an ongoing negotiation, not a destination. From the standpoint of thematic resonance, the film succeeds because it marries spectacle with philosophy. Every major event doubles as metaphor, the prison as commodification of human life, the plane as liminality, the girl as possibility, the antagonist as nihilism, the betrayals as systemic critique. This layering is what invites literary audiences to engage with it as more than a thriller. It is not simply about who kills whom, but about what those killings signify, what they reveal about human endurance, about the fragility of conscience, about the dangers of excess. The reception, too, has been shaped by these critical lenses. Some dismissed it as derivative spectacle, but but others saw in it a bold attempt to merge blockbuster aesthetics with existential inquiry. The flamboyance of the villain divided audiences. Was it camp undermining gravitas, or genius destabilizing expectation? The relentless pace exhausted some, yet for others it underscored the very exhaustion of moral struggle. In this split reception, the film achieved precisely what its narrative promised: to unsettle, to provoke, to resist easy resolution. Ultimately, what makes these events so impactful is their refusal to exist only within the boundaries of fiction. They resonate because they mirror truths we recognize in our own world. The commodification of people, the punishment of conscience, the allure of nihilism, the fragility of loyalty. These are not inventions of cinema, but reflections of lived reality. The story takes these realities and dresses them in spectacle so we cannot look away. The explosions, the chases, the confrontations, all of them are mirrors, and what we see staring back is ourselves, caught in our own battles between survival and morality. And so, as the credits roll, what remains is not the image of collapsing planes or flamboyant villains, but the lingering question: in a world as gray as this, what choices will we make? That is the true power of the film, not that it entertains us, though it does, but that it implicates us, drawing us into its moral labyrinth and leaving us to find our own way out. What often lingers in my memory when reflecting on this film isn't just the finished product we streamed on our screens, but the winding journey of how it came to be, the collection of choices, accidents, stubbornness, and creative leaps that stitched it together. The production itself reads like a parallel narrative, a story about artists and technicians grappling with the scale of ambition, sometimes succeeding through meticulous planning, sometimes stumbling into brilliance by sheer chance. When I think of the filmmaking process here, I imagine a stage filled with people chasing perfection while trying not to collapse under the weight of expectation. One of the first insights that feels important to recall is the unusual decision to greenlight a project of this magnitude as a streaming release. At the time, the industry was still debating whether streaming platforms could deliver the same prestige and spectacle as theatrical blockbusters. For the producers, this film was a gamble meant to prove that streaming didn't have to mean small. And so they threw staggering resources into its creation, shaping it into one of the most expensive projects ever crafted for the platform. That decision alone shaped the tone of production. The crew worked with both the freedom and the pressure of knowing they were defining a precedent, that their film would either be celebrated as the dawn of a new kind of cinema or criticized as an overindulgent experiment. The directors, already seasoned by their work on massive superhero franchises, leaned into that pressure with a sense of curiosity. They wanted to build something fast, sleek, and relentless. They approached each set piece not simply as action sequences, but as puzzles: how to make a chase feel different, how to frame a fight so that audiences felt claustrophobic rather than detached, how to use cities as characters in themselves. Behind the camera, the cinematographer Roman Vassianov worked closely with drone operators, Steadicam specialists, and visual effects artists to choreograph movement that seemed both chaotic and precise. What's fascinating is how many of these sequences required rehearsals more akin to dance than combat. Stunt teams drilled the timing of car flips, explosions, and near misses, as though practicing choreography for a ballet, except here the dancers carried rifles and knives. One of the strangest anecdotes comes from a chase sequence through narrow European streets. The crew had closed off parts of Prague for multiple nights, transforming historic architecture into a battlefield of screeching tires and gunfire. But the oddity lay in how the locals reacted. Rather than staying indoors, hundreds of residents gathered at their windows or even climbed onto rooftops to watch filming unfold. Imagine a midnight street filled with extras running in panic while, just above them, real people leaned from balconies, cell phones in hand, capturing footage of actors sprinting past armored vehicles. The line between fiction and reality blurred, and for weeks afterward, the city carried an aftertaste of unreality, as though the war zone they had witnessed wasn't fully gone. There are also smaller, almost invisible production choices that fascinate me. For instance, the costume department spent weeks designing the antagonist's eccentric wardrobe. His shirts, patterned with almost gaudy flair, were chosen specifically to clash with the otherwise muted color palette of the film. The reasoning was symbolic, but also practical. He had to stand out in every frame, to disrupt the visual harmony like a note played off-key. In interviews, the actor revealed he had a hand in selecting many of these shirts himself, insisting that his character would dress not for subtlety, but for intimidation through ridicule. What's strange is how much debate this decision sparked on set. Some crew members feared it would tip the tone into parody, while others argued it was a stroke of genius. Ultimately, it stuck, and in retrospect, the choice feels inevitable, one of those risks that defines a film long after its release. Another behind-the-scenes story comes from the rigorous stunt training undertaken by the cast. Ryan Gosling, known for his meticulous commitment, trained in combat drills for months, not only rehearsing physicality, but also learning to suppress expression during movement. The idea was that his character's efficiency should feel ghost-like, devoid of theatrics, a man doing violence as quietly as one might wash dishes. By contrast, Chris Evans leaned into improvisation during fight rehearsals, often exaggerating movements or throwing in unexpected gestures just to unsettle his sparring partners. Their clashing preparation methods mirrored the opposition of their characters, and this carried onto the set itself. Crew members later joked that watching the two men rehearse was like seeing minimalism duel with flamboyance, a duel that electrified the final cut. The technical hurdles were immense. One of the most challenging set pieces involved an airplane spiraling into chaos midair. Instead of relying entirely on CGI, the production built large gimbals and rotating sets to simulate a cabin flipping and tearing apart. Actors and stunt performers strapped themselves into these spinning rigs, thrown around violently while still delivering lines and reactions. The cameras, secured to rigs themselves, rotated alongside, giving the impression of a collapsing world. The result is one of those moments where the sheer physicality bleeds through the screen. Knowing that much of what we see was captured practically adds a visceral edge, a reminder of how far the team pushed the boundaries between simulation and real risk. Even the quieter scenes held their own strange stories. Take, for example, the sequences of the protagonist bonding with the young girl he protects. These were shot with an unusual method. The directors instructed the actors to improvise gentle conversation during rehearsals, filming even when they thought cameras weren't rolling. The goal was to capture unpolished intimacy, the stutters and awkwardness of genuine care. One day, the girl forgot her lines entirely and instead asked the actor a question out of character. Rather than breaking the moment, he responded naturally, guiding her back into the scene. The directors, watching from behind monitors, whispered to keep rolling. That improvised exchange, never in the script, ended up forming one of the film's most moving moments. This anecdote reminds me that some of the most authentic pieces of cinema are stumbled upon rather than crafted with intention. Then there are the technical quirks no audience could ever guess. The film makes liberal use of drones to achieve frenetic, bird-like shots weaving between alleys and city streets. Yet behind this innovation were countless crashes, smashed propellers, and near disasters. Crew members joked that the drone budget alone could have funded an indie film. At one point, a drone clipped the edge of a building during a chase sequence and spiraled directly into a car's windshield. Instead of cutting the shot, the directors loved the rawness of the impact and wove it into the sequence. That willingness to embrace accidents as aesthetic choices feels deeply emblematic of the production's ethos: polish where necessary, but chaos where possible. There were also cultural ripples caused by the shoot. In one European neighborhood, residents complained that the thunderous noise of simulated gunfire kept children awake late into the night. Yet oddly, weeks later, the same residents were bragging to tourists about living where one of the biggest action films in years had been shot. It's an example of how filmmaking leaves imprints on real communities, turning ordinary spaces into sites of cinematic memory. Editing, too, carried its own curiosities. The original cut reportedly ran nearly 3 hours, delving deeper into subplots about the intelligence agency's inner workings and offering more of the villain's strange philosophy. The test audiences grew restless, and the directors chose to carve the narrative down into a faster, tighter beast. This ruthless editing left entire arcs on the cutting room floor. Rumor has it that one of these subplots involved a shadowy figure training other agents, scenes that might have hinted at future installments. The strangeness of this decision lies in how the final film is haunted by these absences. You can feel the ghost of larger world building beneath the streamlined story, as though watching the skeleton of a larger myth that remains unseen. One particularly unusual anecdote involves Chris Evans and his mustache, which became an odd talking point during the shoot. The mustache was initially a subtle design, but Evans insisted it should be larger, more prominent, almost cartoonish. His reasoning was that the character saw himself as a peacock, flaunting bravado even in violence. The directors laughed, but agreed to let him experiment. The mustache soon became iconic, a symbol of arrogance and vanity. It's strange to think that one of the most discussed visual elements of the film came from such an offhand insistence during costume trials. The sense of camaraderie on set, despite the intensity, also produced surprising stories. The cast bonded over their injuries, bruises, twisted ankles, even stitches, and joked that whoever walked away from the day least battered owed everyone drinks. Crew members spoke of nights in foreign hotels where actors, exhausted from stunt rehearsals, still found energy to sit together over beer, sharing stories not of Hollywood but of family, regrets, and fears. That intimacy bled into their performances, particularly in the moments where characters tested or betrayed one another. Finally, I can't forget the story of the soundtrack. Composed by Disasterpiece, the score blended electronic textures with orchestral swells. Yet what most don't know is that many of the electronic distortions were created from field recordings captured during production. Sounds of helicopters, ricocheting blanks, and even the metallic clang of prop weapons were manipulated into rhythms and motifs. Listening closely, you can hear the texture of the production itself stitched into the music. It's as though the chaos of filming was transmuted into sound, immortalized not only in image, but in the very fabric of the score. Taken together, these production insights and fun facts reveal a story as compelling as the film itself. They show us that cinema is not a clean process, but a chaotic collaboration where improvisation, accidents, and eccentric decisions often create the most memorable moments. For me, reflecting on these stories deepens my appreciation of what we see on screen, not just as entertainment, but as the residue of countless human struggles, arguments, jokes, and leaps of faith. Behind every polished frame lies an untidy reality, and it is in that untidiness that cinema feels most alive. What strikes me most about thinking back to how this film came together isn't simply the spectacle of what we see on the screen, but the quieter, stranger, often funnier realities that lived behind the cameras. These stories, tucked into the margins of production, are the threads that make the film feel alive not only as a piece of art, but as a lived experience for the people who made it. When we speak about behind the scenes, it's easy to imagine endless technical jargon and heavy machinery, but what really lingers are the moments of camaraderie, the surprising bursts of levity in the middle of exhaustion, and the challenges that seemed insurmountable until someone, actor, stunt double, or technician, decided to solve them in the most human way possible. One of the most often retold stories from the set is about Ryan Gosling and his relationship with the stunt crew. Though he arrived on set already prepared for months of combat and weapons training, what surprised people was his insistence on learning every nuance of the stunt work, even pieces that would ultimately be hidden under editing or performed by doubles. On more than one occasion, he spent hours working alongside stunt coordinators, not because it was required, but because he wanted to know how every member of the team saw the choreography. The result was an atmosphere of mutual respect, where the line between actor and stunt double blurred. Crew members joked that he wasn't just the gray man in the story. He was also a kind of gray man on set, moving fluidly between roles, never demanding center stage. It gave everyone the sense that the action wasn't about ego, but about collective performance. Chris Evans, on the other hand, brought an entirely different energy. Where Gosling leaned into quiet focus, Evans leaned into playful chaos. His character was written as flamboyant and taunting, and it seems he never really dropped that spirit while filming. On days when the mood dipped, he would stride onto set in costume, mustache freshly combed, and break into mock villainous speeches directed not at the cast but at the crew. Camera operators would find themselves being threatened mid-shot, gaffers mocked for their allegiance to the wrong side. These antics often caused bursts of laughter that broke the intensity of long shooting days. What's remarkable is how this atmosphere fed back into the work. The villainous absurdity that audiences see in the final cut wasn't conjured only for the cameras. It was lived, exaggerated, and performed even when the slate wasn't clapping. The directors, Joe and Anthony Russo, also fostered a collaborative environment that surprised many of the crew. Fresh off the Marvel juggernaut, expectations were that they might carry themselves with untouchable authority. Instead, their style was deeply conversational. They often held late-night sessions with editors, stunt teams, and even set designers, inviting everyone to toss ideas into the mix. One designer recalls that the elaborate rotating airplane set, a gimbal that physically flipped actors upside down, was originally pitched during an informal brainstorming session, almost as a joke. The Russos didn't dismiss it. Instead, they leaned in, asked, "What if?" And within weeks, engineers were constructing it. The willingness to treat wild ideas as possible solutions created a playground where challenges were met with imagination rather than defeat. But it wasn't always lighthearted. There were days of grueling frustration, particularly during the on-location shoots in Prague. The city became both a gift and a curse for the production. On one hand, its historic architecture provided cinematic grandeur, without requiring digital reconstruction. On the other, filming in narrow cobblestone streets with heavy equipment and military vehicles created logistical nightmares. More than once, armored trucks scraped against ancient stone walls, sparking panic calls to city officials. One night, a carefully timed explosion sequence had to be canceled at the last minute because a local church bell began tolling, drowning out the audio. Rather than despair, the crew leaned into gallows humor. Someone quipped that the villain was summoning the bells of hell, and soon it became a running joke, with cast members mimicking ominous chimes between takes. The young actress playing the girl under Gosling's protection also became a beacon of energy. Though the narrative placed her in vulnerable circumstances, off-camera she displayed confidence that caught everyone off guard. Crew members recall how she quickly became the mascot of the set, wandering between departments with a natural curiosity, asking sound engineers to explain microphones, or pestering makeup artists to try their brushes. On particularly long days, she insisted on telling jokes to the crew before cameras rolled, as if she understood instinctively that humor was the glue holding everyone together. What's heartwarming is how the older actors responded. They protected her, teased her, and occasionally let her direct practice takes, a game where she yelled action, just to feel part of the family. These tiny gestures helped balance the darker tone of the film with real warmth. There were also challenges that threatened to derail entire sequences. The drone shots, for instance, nearly didn't happen. The idea of using drones for dynamic weaving shots through alleys was ambitious, but the first week of testing resulted in one crash after another. Insurance companies grew nervous, producers began to worry about ballooning costs, and there were whispers of abandoning the technique altogether. Yet the drone operators, many of whom were hobbyists turned professionals, refused to give up. They worked after hours, practicing with smaller rigs, mapping flight paths frame by frame, until they found ways to thread the machines through impossibly tight spaces. One night, after a particularly spectacular test run, the crew erupted into applause. The moment was described as a minor miracle, a triumph of persistence. Without those stubborn technicians, some of the film's most thrilling shots would never have existed. Even the villain's mustache had its own strange behind-the-scenes saga. Early tests with different styles, thinner, thicker, curled, produced endless debate. One makeup artist later joked that they spent more time perfecting the mustache than choreographing a fight. Evans himself reportedly pushed for the bolder look, believing it captured his character's vanity. When he first walked onto set with the exaggerated mustache, some crew members burst out laughing, while others quietly wondered if it was a mistake. Yet as the days went on, the absurdity grew into its own kind of brilliance. The mustache became a shorthand on set. Whenever someone overacted or flubbed a line, others would whisper, "Add more mustache." What began as a point of doubt evolved into a running gag, and eventually, one of the film's most iconic visual signatures. The physical toll of filming also left its mark. Gosling, despite his preparation, sustained bruises and minor injuries from the intensity of stunt work. Evans sprained his wrist during a rehearsal, but continued shooting, joking that his character would simply weaponize the pain. Crew members kept a whiteboard tally of on-set injuries, turning the grim reality into a game. Whoever made it through the day without injury earned the right to sign the board with a triumphant flourish. Far from demoralizing the team, this strange ritual reinforced their sense of solidarity. They weren't suffering alone, they were accumulating battle scars together. Food, too, played a surprising role in maintaining morale. Filming in Europe meant access to an array of local cuisines, and the catering crew became unsung heroes. Long after midnight shoots, cast and crew would gather around makeshift tables to share steaming bowls of goulash or fresh bread. Evans reportedly developed an obsession with a particular bakery near the set, sending assistants to fetch pastries for the entire team. These communal meals, simple as they were, created bonds that lasted beyond the shoot. Actors have spoken about how those nights of shared food were as important to the film's success as any rehearsal, because they reminded everyone of their humanity amid the chaos of production. And then there were the accidents that turned into gifts. One day, during a chase sequence, a pyrotechnic charge went off slightly too early, shattering glass in a way no one had planned. Instead of cutting, the directors urged the actors to keep going, capturing their genuine shock on camera. The moment was so raw and authentic that it was woven seamlessly into the final cut. Incidents like these became reminders of why filmmaking thrives on unpredictability. Sometimes the most striking images are born from mistakes, not blueprints. Through all of this, what stands out is the sense of shared resilience. Every obstacle, whether logistical, technical, or physical, was met with a mixture of humor, grit, and creativity. When the plane set threatened to make actors sick from its relentless spinning, they turned nausea into comedy, competing over who could last longest without reaching for a bucket. When rain interrupted outdoor shoots, lighting teams transformed puddles into reflective surfaces that enhanced the scene's beauty. Challenges weren't merely overcome, they were transformed into opportunities. In reflecting on these behind-the-scenes insights, I'm reminded that cinema is always more than the story it tells. It's also the story of the people who tell it, of the laughter behind ruined takes, the bruises hidden under costumes, the shared meals after exhausting nights. For this film, that story is one of contrasts: discipline and chaos, seriousness and silliness, exhaustion and joy. And in many ways, those very contrasts are what the film itself explores on screen. It's as though the production and the narrative mirrored each other, both built on tension, conflict, and the stubborn insistence to keep moving forward no matter the odds. The result is not only a piece of entertainment, but also a testament to human collaboration at its messiest and most beautiful. To know these stories is to watch the film differently, to see not just characters in conflict, but artists in communion, shaping something larger than themselves. That, perhaps, is the most lasting behind-the-scenes insight of all. Cinema is not about perfection, but about persistence, about finding meaning in the unlikeliest corners of effort, accident, and laughter. What always lingers in my memory when I think about this film isn't just the sharp choreography of its fights or the cat-and-mouse tension between characters, but the way space itself seemed to carry a voice. The world built around these people wasn't just backdrop, it was a character in its own right, at times silent and looming, at other times chaotic and relentless, pressing in on the characters with its textures, its shadows, its noise. The settings and cinematic choices gave the narrative a pulse that you could almost feel in your chest. They turned the globetrotting adventure into something mythic, as though every city, every room, every vehicle whispered its own commentary on what it meant to survive, to pursue, to fight, and to escape. The production leaned heavily on real locations, and that choice mattered. Instead of constructing sterile studio backdrops, the filmmakers plunged the cast into the grit and unpredictability of Prague, Vienna, and other European streets. Narrow alleys weathered stone, cobblestones slick with night rain, they all spoke of history, of blood that might have been spilled centuries before, of secrets lurking behind facades. The camera didn't just pass through these places. It lingered on the way headlights bounced off wet asphalt, or how firelight licked against cathedral walls during moments of chaos. In doing so, the settings became extensions of the story's moral ambiguity. Here was a world where beauty and brutality coexisted, where centuries of art and architecture collided with modern violence. The Prague sequences, in particular, still live in my head like a fever dream. There's something about watching armored vehicles tearing through streets lined with Baroque architecture that creates a surreal dissonance. It's as if history itself is being invaded, desecrated, rewritten by the greed and power games of the present. The use of drones in these chases emphasized the geography of the city: tight turns, open plazas, sudden bursts of verticality with staircases and rooftops. The geography wasn't neutral. It dictated the movement of the chase, forcing characters into split-second decisions, compressing them into claustrophobic corridors before spitting them out into wide, exposed squares. This interplay between confinement and exposure mirrored the protagonist's journey, forever caught between being trapped and being thrust into the open. And then there were the interiors, safe houses that never truly felt safe. Opulent halls where chandeliers glistened above men planning atrocities. Stark CIA bunkers buzzing with fluorescent lighting that hummed a kind of inhuman efficiency. Each location was dressed with detail that pulled us deeper into the world's contradictions. A room filled with velvet curtains and golden frames could just as easily host betrayal as beauty. The cinematography leaned into these contradictions, painting shadows thick across ornate walls, placing characters half-lit, as though their morality could never be seen in full. The airplane sequence was one of the most striking uses of cinematic space. Inside a vessel meant to represent control and dominance, the machine of war itself, we witnessed collapse. The set literally spun, breaking all sense of orientation. Up became down, safety became destruction, and the actors were tossed like ragdolls in a mechanical storm. This wasn't just spectacle. It was symbolism embodied in architecture and movement. The spinning cabin showed us what it felt like when systems implode, when the carefully built structures of authority and technology betray the very people inside them. By using a practical gimbal instead of relying entirely on CGI, the filmmakers allowed the audience to feel the weight, the nausea, the terror of collapsing order. Cinematography was the glue that bound all of this together. Roman Vassianov's camera work often slid between extremes, moments of frenetic movement followed by sudden stillness. The lens would sometimes chase characters with jittery urgency, drones weaving like hunting birds through alleys, only to pull back for a wide, painterly shot of destruction framed against centuries-old architecture. This rhythm created a constant tension between intimacy and spectacle. We weren't just watching explosions, we were watching individuals swallowed by the enormity of the world around them. Color grading played its part too. The palette leaned toward desaturated blues, grays, and blacks, interrupted by sudden bursts of heat, orange flames, crimson blood, the garish patterned shirts of the villain. These intrusions of color weren't random, they were symbolic jolts. They represented disruption, ego, violence crashing into the muted tones of a world otherwise drained of vibrancy. The villain's flamboyant costumes clashed violently against the subdued palette, embodying his role as a figure who thrived on discord. It wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. The point was to jolt, to make you uncomfortable, to remind you that chaos doesn't blend, it scars. Sound design and cinematography worked hand in hand to build atmosphere. Think about the echo of boots in empty halls, the hiss of smoke grenades filling narrow staircases, the shattering of glass reverberating off stone walls. The filmmakers leaned into reverb, into distortion, into layering sound so that it felt oppressive, swallowing you whole. It wasn't enough to see chaos, you had to hear it bouncing back at you, as though the city itself was amplifying the violence. The natural environments, though fewer, also carried symbolic weight. Remote compounds framed against bleak landscapes emphasized isolation, exile, and the futility of escape. Water, too, appeared as a recurring visual motif, rivers, fountains, reflections on pavement. It often arrived as a counterpoint to fire and destruction, suggesting both renewal and drowning. I remember the way rain fell during certain sequences, blurring lenses, distorting outlines, making the violence less crisp and more dreamlike. Rain in cinema often cleanses, but here it mudded, making everything harder to see, harder to distinguish, as though morality itself was running off into the gutter. Editing reinforced the effect of setting. Quick cuts during chases amplified disorientation, but the editors were careful to let wide, establishing shots breathe, reminding us of the geography of violence. You always knew where you were, even when it felt overwhelming. That's a rare balance, to preserve spatial clarity without sacrificing momentum. It's why the Prague sequence resonates so strongly. The audience never felt lost, even as the characters were gasping for air. Light, too, played its role as narrative. Flickering neon signs during clandestine exchanges, candlelit rooms where shadows overtook faces, blinding sunlight that forced squints and silhouettes during moments of confrontation. Light was wielded not only to illuminate but to expose or conceal, depending on the emotional tenor of the scene. Characters often stepped into half-light, their features obscured, their intentions unreadable. It was a visual reminder that no one in this world was whole, that everyone existed in fragments of light and shadow. Even the vehicles functioned as settings in themselves. Cars became coffins, fortresses, or weapons depending on how they were filmed. The camera is often hugged close to the metal frames during chases, vibrating with the roar of engines, then pulled wide to show the vehicles as tiny insects darting through sprawling urban landscapes. This duality, intimate claustrophobia and expansive insignificance, added depth to scenes that could otherwise have been empty spectacle. Looking back, I find myself thinking of the film's settings as mirrors of the characters' internal states. When the protagonist found himself in narrow, suffocating corridors, it wasn't just geography, it was a reflection of his isolation, his entrapment within systems bigger than him. When the villain strutted across wide, brightly lit spaces, it wasn't just arrogance, it was his craving for stage and spectacle, his need to be larger than life. The environments didn't just host the story. They amplified it, echoed it, sharpened it, and this is why, for me, the cinematic elements here feel so much more than technical craft. They carry philosophy. They whisper questions. What does it mean to fight in a place drenched in history? What does it mean when beauty becomes backdrop for brutality? Can space hold memory, and does that memory seep into the present? These choices remind us that cinema isn't about neutrality, it's about shaping the very air around the characters, the way we feel the story pressing against us. Every street, every room, every crash of light and sound contributed to a world that wasn't simply constructed for action. It was sculpted for resonance. Watching it unfold, I didn't just follow the plot, I inhabited the spaces. I felt the weight of cobblestones underfoot, the echo of gunfire off cathedral walls, the vertigo of spinning cabins, the uneasy glare of fluorescent lights. And in those sensations, the film's meaning deepened. becoming less about who won or lost, and more about what it feels like to exist in a world perpetually tilted between control and collapse. When I arrive at the end of this long exploration, I find myself pausing, not to summarize in the mechanical sense, but to breathe in what the journey has really meant. We've walked through the spaces of this film, as though through haunted cities and echoing corridors, where action beats turned into philosophical questions, and where the architecture of setting carried as much narrative weight as any line of dialogue. We've spoken of the strange, surreal dissonance of armored trucks rolling past Baroque arches, of rain that blurred morality as much as it did outlines, of a spinning airplane cabin that wasn't merely spectacle but a metaphor for collapsing systems of power. And in all of that, we've reminded ourselves that cinema is not simply the plot on the page, it is the lived pulse of light, sound, body, and place. Looking back on the arc of our conversation, what strikes me is how the story itself constantly folded back on the world it inhabited. The protagonist's movements weren't isolated decisions. They were shaped by cobblestones, by narrow alleys, by glaring fluorescent lights. Every chase, every confrontation was tethered to geography and mood, echoing the interior conflicts he carried. And the villain, flamboyant and brazen, never stood in neutral rooms. He occupied spaces that magnified his ego, wide and brightly lit, the world itself bending to his need for performance. In this way, setting became mirror, stage, and silent commentator, pushing us to feel more than to merely watch. We also wandered behind the cameras, where reality sometimes intruded in unexpected ways. Stories of Ryan Gosling's commitment to authenticity, of Chris Evans using his mustache as both joke and weapon of characterization, of drones crashing until persistence turned them into miracles. All of these glimpses peeled back the curtain and revealed the messier, more human truth of filmmaking. These weren't polished anecdotes crafted for press tour. They were battle scars, laughter, late-night meals of goulash, and the smell of wet cobblestones after rain. In sharing those details, the film reminded us that art is born in the unpredictable space where failure and triumph coexist. And then there were the themes we drew like threads through everything. Questions of control versus collapse, light and shadow not just as cinematic technique, but as embodiments of moral ambiguity. Fire and water dancing in symbolic opposition, one devouring, the other cleansing but also drowning. We talked about how space itself can become memory, and how memory bleeds into the present, turning every city street into a palimpsest of old violence and new ambition. These themes weren't separate from the characters. They were inscribed into their arcs, into the very way their footsteps echoed in the spaces they traversed. So much of what resonates with me personally is how this film refuses neutrality. It doesn't simply hand us a world in which events unfold. It insists that the world itself is complicit, that the stones and shadows and sounds are as much characters as the people inhabiting them. Watching it, I found myself asking whether the spaces I move through in my own life hold memories, whether the rooms I occupy influence my choices more than I realize. That is the mark of cinema that goes beyond entertainment. It stirs reflection, it lingers after the credits, it shapes how we look at our own shadows and our own streets. And that is where our journey closes for now. We've charted the story's movements, traced the arcs of its characters, reveled in the chaos of its production, laughed at its odd behind-the-scenes rituals, and marveled at the sheer artistry of its spaces and soundscapes. We've stepped back to analyze, but also leaned in to feel. What's left is the echo, the way a film continues to speak long after the screen fades to black, reminding us that stories don't end when the lights come up. They keep reshaping how we think, how we remember, and how we imagine. If you've stayed with me through this exploration, I want to thank you not just for listening, but for engaging with the kind of analysis that looks deeper, that treats cinema as text, as philosophy, as a mirror of human experience. This has never been about reviewing in the conventional sense. It's been about sharing reflections, weaving together images and ideas, offering a way of seeing that is as much about literature and theory as it is about spectacle. My hope is that these journeys give you not just knowledge, but a kind of companionship in thought, a reminder that stories are always richer when explored together. So as we step away from this particular film and all its shadows, spectacle, and whispered questions, I invite you to stay connected. If this exploration resonated with you, if it stirred thought or offered a new perspective, I'd be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. Not for the algorithm, not for vanity, but because it helps us keep building a community of people who love to peel back the layers, who see cinema not as disposable entertainment, but as a language of symbols, emotions, and truths. There are so many more stories waiting to be unraveled, and I'd love for you to be part of that unfolding conversation. Until then, carry these echoes with you, the flicker of light, the the crash of waves, the spinning of a cabin, the footsteps across cobblestones. Let them remind you that every story is a map, every film a mirror, and every analysis a doorway into seeing more deeply. And I'll be here, ready to walk with you through the next doorway, into the next world of light and shadow.